My name is Jessica Hong. I'm the Associate Curator of Global Contemporary Art at the Hood Museum. And I'm going to let Vivian introduce herself. Oh, I believe she may be actually frozen.
Oh, it looks like she may be frozen.
Well, so I'll introduce Vivian on her behalf until she unfreezes. So Vivian Ladd is teaching specialist, and we're all really delighted that you're here with us virtually today. And just to note, you may have heard this when you first joined, but we are recording this program for archival purposes. And then we're going to share the link on our social media outlets for those who can't participate with us today. Just to note, I'm going to ask everyone if you're able to, on your devices, if you have the capability to have a side-by-side view. Each device is a little bit different, but if you go to the top of your screen, there should be a view options scroll down button. There's a little caret, and you click on side-by-side mode. And so you'll see the panelists as well as the PowerPoint presentation. Hi again, Vivian.
So sorry. I've lost my internet temporarily.
I did a quick e-introduction, but if you also want to.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vivian Ladd, and I am a teaching specialist here at the Hood Museum of Art.
So I was just asking people to be in side-by-side view if possible. So this is actually the Hood's first virtual public program.
My screen is freezing. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
oh, no, it's okay.
Same here. Same here.
I'm here.
There.
I'm seeing that my internet connection is a bit unstable. Is everybody else having a similar problem? Sharon or Jessica?
I'm okay. I'm hardwired, so it's a little bit easier on my end. But hopefully, I mean, so I was going to say that this is actually the Hood's first virtual public program. So there may be some technical issues along the way, and we appreciate your patience with us during this time. But I also want to thank my colleagues at the Hood for their creativity and willingness to adapt during this time, especially as you see Sharon Reed, who is our programs and events manager, and Isadora Atalia, our campus engagement manager, who worked with Vivian and I on this program. So before Vivian and I start this conversation, we just want to acknowledge that originally this was supposed to be an exhibition tour of Reconstitution, but that this is not going to be a typical exhibition tour, nor will it be a virtual exhibition tour. We're not going to attempt to replicate the museum experience, but rather take this as an opportunity to try and find new ways to explore and facilitate dialogue through the arts. We also feel it's important to recognize that we're in uncertain and unprecedented times. With the novel coronavirus, there is a gravity to all of this. There has been a sense of loss for many, and we've been forced indoors. We must separate ourselves from each other. And there's so many other social, economic, and political consequences of COVID-19, as well as those we may not understand for some time. There will be change, and change is inevitable, but it doesn't always have to be negative. And we can take the role of participant in that change. And we and many of you are going through a lot, so know that you're not alone. And though Vivian, Sharon, and I as individuals, and the Hood as a museum can only do so much, we do believe that the arts can be a creative, productive space for exploration and conversation, not just during this time, but in perpetuity. So we hope that the Hood's programs are constructive spaces for all of you, and that we continue to build community and look for possibilities to shape new futures collectively. So the full program is going to run until around 1:30, so about an hour. Vivian and I will first talk about the framework of the exhibition Reconstitution. Then we're going to look closely and do a deep dive into 3 works. One suite of engravings, which was actually the starting point for the exhibition. And then 2 photographic works by different contemporary artists. And I will say that all of the artists in the exhibition are engaging with the power and impact of representation and the image in distinct ways. But how does their impact shift or change in this virtual space as we're unable to experience the exhibition or access the works in person? So we're going to, the best we can, make this as much of a discussion with you as possible. We're going to ask you questions along the way, especially when looking at particular works. So feel free to participate only if you wish. Just so that there isn't a cacophony of voices, people will be muted. There is an option to raise your hand on Zoom, which I know some of you have already demonstrated. So Vivian will actually be looking for those raising their hands, and she'll call on you to respond. Sharon is also here. She'll be managing the chat function, which is different from the Q&A function. So please stick with the chat function. And you can message Sharon directly if you're experiencing issues. She's not going to be able to fix everyone's internet connections, but she will be here if you want to ask or comment, during our conversation, and we've missed you. So please message her directly. As I mentioned, this is a pretty novel format for all of us, and it's definitely an experiment. So again, we may have technical issues along the way, in addition to kind of our start today. But we're going to do our best. We may not get to all of you. We have about 65 participants now, and we're cognizant of everyone's time as well, so we can see how much more time at the end we have for conversation. And lastly, because we can't see each other, it's just a reminder to please be patient, be present with us, and respectful of one another when people are speaking. And with that, thank you again for spending time with us today. So
I'm sorry, Jessica, I just wanted to say I'm going to pop off so you won't see me, but do know that I will be monitoring chat, and I'll pop back on.
All right, thank you, Sharon. So I just wanted to, we're going to share just a couple of install shots of the exhibition that is currently on view, but unfortunately, of course, the hood is closed to the public at this time. So for those that have seen the exhibition, it's a little bit of a refresher of what the exhibition kind of looks like. And for those that haven't experienced the exhibition, a little bit of contextual or visual grounding and in the actual exhibition. But we're going to start with a looking exercise. As I mentioned, these engravings by Crispin de Pas was actually the starting point of the exhibition. And so I have the 4 engravings up here, and then Vivian, just let me know if you want me to peruse, because I also have the individual engravings in this PowerPoint as well.
That sounds great. I think we'll start with them as a group, and we wanted to offer opportunities for people to share their perspectives. So I'm going to invite you all to just take a look at these 4 small engravings. They do represent the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 continents as the world was understood in 1590. And you'll see images of Africa, America, Asia, and Europe. These are, of course, allegories, symbolic representations of these continents, and they represent a particularly European worldview. So our invitation for you is to take a look at all 4 engravings and consider the ways in which they're the same and they're different from Europe. Let's use Europe as our focus and compare the images of Asia, Africa, and America to that of Europe. And in particular, I guess I would draw your attention to pose, dress, the objects that they have in their hands or nearby, and the setting. So you can go ahead and raise your hand if you notice something. Okay, so let's take a look. Now, I would have assumed that when people raise their hand that they would pop forward. Okay. Susan, what did you want to say?
I'll gladly comment briefly that Europe, if that's our comparison departure point, she seems quite well posed. She's dressed somewhat formal and regal.
Great. So can you just be a little bit more specific? What in particular makes her dress formal and regal?
That's a good question. I cede it to somebody who might be able to enlighten me.
All right, John, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. I was thinking strictly about the undress. The regal part seems to come in the epaulets on her shoulders, but also she is thoroughly covered. There's only a little bit of flesh showing, feet and hand and neck. And then Asia is a little bit more risque, a little less clothes. America only has a swoosh, but she at least has a swoosh going all the way across. And then you get to Africa and it's just one little bit of a hip covered. So there seems to be this value, this sliding value judgment in how much clothing they're wearing. And then do we take the leap and say, is that an analogy to civilization or the idea of civilized behavior or something? And I'll lower my hand.
Yeah, great. And so where do we see that sliding scale continue? Perhaps in some of the objects that are included in each of these allegories. Europe is a little hard to see, and I would like to point out that what she has here in her hand appears to be a shield, and there is a gun. How does that compare to the objects in the hands of the other allegorical figures?
Yeah. Bowen.
Does anybody else want to raise a hand? Let's see, we have, oh, I had somebody. I have Mary. Mary, you can go ahead and jump in.
Okay. Well, the things that they're holding seem to be, as John just mentioned, sort of on a little bit of a sliding scale. Europe, you said, has a gun, which was probably very high technology in 1590. And the rest of them are holding, it looks like bows and arrows or just spears. And Africa, I'm not sure, can't really tell that they have any kind of a weapon at all, none at all.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mary. And then finally, I just want to turn our attention to the setting. Just what are your thoughts about the settings for each of these allegorical figures?
I think Sharon had has a comment.
Sharon.
Comment.
Yeah, hi. We have a note from Rebecca in the chat room who notices that Europe seems to have the only animal that appears not to be reptilian as well.
I see. Great, great. So I'm going to hand things back over to Jessica to comment on these observations and what that tells us about Crispin de Pas's worldview.
Yeah, so of course, as the curator of global contemporary art, I'm not an expert on Crispin de Pas. I just want to be very clear in that. But at least, you know, these were the starting point, again, as I mentioned, for Reconstitution. And these are in the Hood's collections. So as everyone kind of noted, that there is an inequity to the representation of each of the continents. And for myself, you know, standing in 2019, when I was organizing this exhibition, I was, in addition to the inequities, you know, each of the continents are also represented as singular anglicized women. And I, you know, do want to note that Crispin de Pas was a very successful and well-known engraver in his day. He had this, he essentially created this family dynasty of engravers known throughout Europe. But from the research that I did on this, on de Pas, it didn't seem that he actually traveled outside of Europe. So much of his understanding of of these other continents would have been either through other travelers or even his own imagination. So as a lot of you have noted, you know, Europe is the only one with the most advanced weapons. She's fully clothed in royal dress. And so it led me to think about the effects of such representations throughout the history of art, as well as the weight of history. And so this exhibition, you know, I was also thinking about the site of the exhibition itself. You know, it is cited in the colonial site of a museum institution, as well as Dartmouth. And does anyone know what I mean when I say that the museum is a colonial entity?
Looking for
We have
Deborah,
someone saying no.
Deb, do you want to jump in? It's a little tricky to unmute folks, so I'm sorry if there's a delay. I have to look at two separate places. Sorry, Deb, I seem to have lost you in the listing. Okay, Deb, jump right in.
I think it means that the museum stole or was benefited from the stealing of things from around the world, as did colonial powers steal things. So
Mhm.
the museum becomes a repository for those types of thefts.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you for that. And just to elaborate a little bit, the modern museum, the idea of the modern museum, burgeoned throughout Europe in the 18th century, alongside Enlightenment, the Enlightenment movement, and other Western intellectual movements, but had always been tied to, as you were saying, is it Deb or Deborah, to colonial enterprises. For example, in the early 1800s, Napoleon actually expanded and reopened the Louvre, the very beloved Louvre Museum, to the public, but it was also to essentially show his spoils of war. So the museum's history is very much tied to these colonial enterprises and this idea of building the nation state. And so Reconstitution, you think having all of this in mind, it was initially thought of as a prompt to think about who writes history, who has the right to write history, and how these narratives are represented as well as entrenched. But then subsequently, thinking about how artists are contending with that and have for generations, and how they reconstitute these narratives to enable their evolutions, and really reminding us that we're all responsible agents in the ongoing, complicated processes of writing current and future histories. But because, again, we can't see these works in person, Vivian and I wanted to have this discussion with you all about how these, issues shift when we are unable to actually engage physically with these sites, with these objects, and now moving into the virtual space, where it's seemingly expansive, but there is an inequity of access even in the virtual space. What kind of conversations can arise when we're only able to experience these works in the virtual space. So I think that we might just dive in, just being cognizant of time and knowing that it takes a little bit of time to have people participate. I think we might just dive into the two works that we want to focus on today. And I included the singular images of each of these engravings, so I'll just slowly scroll so you can kind of all get a sense of each of the engravings.
So somebody mentioned Africa here does not have any weaponry.
Mm-hmm.
America has this strange reptilian beast, plus the decapitated head at her foot.
What is that about?
Again, it begs the question about that sliding scale that we talked about. And then finally, Asia, who has some clothing, and what appears to be a camel.
Again. And then just to give you some context, these engravings are actually diminutive. They're just about like 2 inches high, 4 inches in width. And this is the title wall for the exhibition. Here's another installation view of the show. And then we're gonna dive in to talk explicitly about this work by Renee Cox, entitled Baby Back, from her American Family series. So Vivian, I'll let you take it away.
Great. So Renee Cox is quite consciously thinking about images like the allegories we just saw in creating this work. And again, I'd like to invite you all to consider how this work is like the allegories we just saw. In what ways is this figure in pose, in dress, in setting, similar to the allegories we've just seen, and in what ways is it quite different? And I have a hand. All right, gotta scroll a little bit here. Jane Deering. Jane, jump right in.
Can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay. Well, the pose, the body is quite beautiful in proportions. Feels very much influenced by Greek and Roman statuary, where the body is perfection, the way we saw most particularly, I think, in the American and African etchings. And then I think the further perfection here is enhanced by this beautiful, glorious satin damask fabric that just glows. It's as smooth as her skin is. And her pose, her face, where it's just 3/4 that you see, is very confident, very reassured, quite powerful, I would say. So those are a couple of the similarities. The red shoes, now that's something totally different. I think she's definitely been shopping at one of the most upmarket stores in the West for, what is that, the Christian Louboutin red shoes.
Great. Thank you, Jane. I'm going to invite somebody else to jump in here. That was very beautiful and very eloquently put. You know, are there other ways that you're noticing that this figure is quite different? How about Erin?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm noticing that this figure is, we don't have access to the front of her body in the same way that we did. We had a different level of access, I think, to the bodies, the female figures that we saw in the engravings. And for me, it communicates like a different type of maybe autonomy and access. I feel like she's presented as, she feels more in control of how she's being represented than
just by the fact that she's turned her back to us.
Yes, and I think also sort of her sort of her very beautiful like physique, but she also looks very strong. Like I sort of notice the strength of her shoulders. She seems sort of active and poised and I feel sort of invited into this scene with her, but also very much like she is in control of how she's being represented and her body more broadly.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take one more hand from Jim. Jim, can you jump right in here?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, this is a piece I love. I think this is the third or fourth time that you've had it out, and so thank you for that. It is like a really kind of more of like a kind of European traditional pose, but less in recline and more in kind of with a sense of power. I think, again, the other comments are very similar to what I'm getting from this. Also, instead of holding a glass of wine or something that might be less, she's holding like an instrument of is it ESMD or like it's like a whip basically, so that again kind of has for a sense of power, a sense of control, and I think that holds through with like the way she's holding her head, and that she's very there's like a sense of realness to her. So yeah, that's
great.
Those thoughts.
Thank you for that. So, everybody collectively here seems to sense more agency in this figure and more control, a certain kind of confidence, but definitely in an image that is evocative of European art forms that we are familiar with. One last thing I'd ask you to consider is the setting, because it is quite different. And just to note that the scale of this figure is quite large. I think it's almost 12 feet long, 10 to 12 feet long, but you can see here in the gallery installation the scale of the figure. So does anybody want to comment on that on terms of scale or setting? And again, at this time, I'm going to call on Elizabeth. Elizabeth, are you with us? Elizabeth? Okay. Don't seem to have Elizabeth. How about, oh, Elizabeth, there you are.
Okay. I had to leave part of this. I kept raising my hand before, and I didn't think, I missed part of the conversation, so people may have said this before, but you asked to comment on the scale. This is so huge and such a drastic change from the tiny little engravings. She's really in your face, but then she's not, because, and someone may have said this before, but the most obvious thing is that her back.
Okay, I'm going to resend her the link and say to try it again.
Oh, no, we're good.
Okay,
We're good.
thanks.
We can hear Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Sorry, Elizabeth.
Commenting on the scale, someone may have said this before, and I just said that it's so dramatic. This is so huge, and the engravings are so tiny, but there's more to it than that. And so this is the part someone may have said before. She's so much in your face, but yet she's not, because her back is turned to us, just the opposite of the 4 engravings. So she's accessible, but yet she's not accessible.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Again, I'm going to turn things over to Jessica to kind of round out this conversation. Sharon, did you need to add something?
I just had a couple people note some things in the chat. From Jim, he's noticing the traditional European pose, and Liam is noticing a flail similar to the Egyptian pharaohs, and noting the stark background and the focus on the figure.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So just to give you a little bit more background about this particular artist and this body of work, Renee Cox is very well known for these large scale photographs, oftentimes including her own body, to critique stereotypical representations of Black women in particular. And Baby Back is part of the artist's, as I mentioned, but also purposely controversial, as she says, American Family series, which in her words is a veritable minefield of taboo topics. So she, as a lot of people have mentioned, overtly reinterprets references as well as reinterprets important historical and art historical moments in much of her work. So she, you may have seen there's a little label that I included in the show, but I include a reference image of one of the paintings that she's referencing. This is kind of the prime example by neoclassical painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who's was part of this. So this is an odalisque figure, which was very much kind of a quote unquote trend, you can say, in painting that emerged, particularly in the French art movement of Orientalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, around the kind of fantasies of exotic cultures, particularly exoticized women. And I include just a side-by-side image comparison of the two paintings, very historically distant, but there are some quotations. You can see the pose mimicking the feathered duster, but rather than the feathered duster, she's holding a whip, which is obviously a very fraught object. Someone brought up, BDSM, but also if you think about a whip as being, as historically kind of referencing the violence of slavery and the continued violence as such. But and someone talked about scale. So she employs scale kind of also intentionally referencing art history, particularly history painting. Does anybody want to talk a bit about history painting? Or I'm happy to as well, but if someone wants to jump in, I'm happy to let them as well.
Don't see any hands.
That's totally fine.
Oh, Sharon
has a hand.
Yeah, we have Andrew Lewin said that the work parallels Le Grand Odalisque by Ingres. The pose is the same.
And Julie just jumped in here. Julie, do you want to add your thoughts? Go ahead, Julie. Try that again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I would just say that, and Jessica, I would love to hear you elaborate on this, but in terms of the hierarchy of painting, in particular from the period of time that the work on the right was executed, I've always thought of history paintings being sort of top of the food chain. So I think there's a statement to be made in mimicking that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as Julie kind of alluded to, during this time period, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries, there was a hierarchy to painting, and history painting was considered the most important, and the quote unquote lowest form was still life. And so history painting kind of focused on images and narratives from classical history, mythological, allegorical, or biblical narratives at a very, very large scale. So if you also think of artists such as Jacques-Louis David, Theodore Géricault, these were all artists that were engaging in history painting. But here, you know, Renee Cox inserts herself into this particular artistic tradition. And also interestingly, in the form of a photograph. The photograph wasn't really considered a fine art form until the latter half of the 20th century. It's been around for some time, but it wasn't really considered a quote unquote high art form until semi-recently. So it's also interesting where she's using this particular medium in reference to, or in some way analogous to painting, you know, the time-old tradition of painting. So in a way, you know, confronting the hierarchy of representation to claim space, regain control, you know, of the types of representation that are depicted in these, whether it's institutional spaces. But, you know, a question does come up when you're looking at this work not in a museum space. But also, I want to go back a little bit. So the museum space, I think that we've been criticized for not having diverse representations included within institutional spaces, including those of audiences. And so what are the complicated kind of conversations that come up when, although Renee Cox as an artist is, you know, defying particular artistic traditions, but the viewer is still relatively homogenous, whether racially, culturally. So what are some of the complications that come up when you're only able to access these images in the virtual space? And these are not necessarily questions that I have answers to. I see some blinking lights in my chat, so I'm curious if anyone has a response to that.
I don't have any hands raised. Question.
Yes, so we have, again, Andrew is saying she's wily, she's reinterpreting and transforming the history painting by changing the protagonist.
Thank you, Andy. Does anyone else have any comments? Particularly,
yeah. I have Suzanne wants to jump in. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Hello. Just to be a little bit contrary, my immediate response was that this figure, and are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
The figure was a little more passive than I expected. I compared her in my mind to Titian or Manet's Olympia, where the figure who reclines on a very similar couch confronts the viewer head on, face on, as an equal and demanding and, you know, in your face. And I felt this was actually much more passive, more object of the male gaze and more traditional.
Interesting. Does anyone else have a response to either to Susan or reactions to this work before we move on to the next body of work? Sharon?
Yeah, we have Dan who actually wants to make a note of the Renee Cox in relation to the engravings that we looked at earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He said initially it looks like it might be out of context, at least visually, whereas the four women of the allegorical engravings were placed in a specific background setting. Baby back has the geography all blacked out and is almost context free, which allows us to add the context. Or
And Susan also wanted to weigh in here.
Well, I think this is a very provocative question about the audience.
Mm-hmm.
I never really quite thought about that, and I don't have a thought formed fully, but I wanted to comment that when I would, well, just off the top of my head, I think if I'm holding a certain image of an African-American woman of a certain age and I don't know anybody personally, so I can't even bring that experience, then I think this is good for somebody like me to see a different one. I mean, that's pretty obvious what you're talking about, but I did look at some things about Renee Cox for our meetings in the fall or the winter. And I was interested that she went to a Catholic school and she never saw herself represented in any of the biblical or liturgical images and scriptures. And so that's when Giuliani in New York took her on, because she presented herself in this image of Jesus at the Last Supper. And given that it's Holy Week, I thought I'd just mention that.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I mean, you know, of course there's the artist intention and the agency of the artist, but there are questions that arise when it's kind of put out there in the world. You know, images can be interpreted in many different ways depending on the individual's, you know, experiences and projections, where this work is situated, whether it's in a museum space or us kind of together in the virtual space, only looking at this kind of more flattened image, because you're not necessarily getting the impact of the original kind of large scale photograph, which is actually comprised of 3 photos. When she was printing this particular work, there wasn't a printer, and I don't know if there's a printer that exists that's large enough to actually print at this scale. So what are I would like us to kind of think about.
So before we move on, Jessica, I have 2 more hands raised, Jane and Suzanne. So Jane, why don't you just go ahead and jump in?
There's a small object in the lower right-hand corner. I don't know what it is. I can't really see it clearly enough on my screen. So that was a question about what that is, and does it have, what is the importance of it? The second thing is an observation. The strands of hair that fall over her left shoulder seems to me to link to that whip that she has, as though those might be symbols of the cruel wounds that were inflicted during slavery. So I wondered if you could comment on those.
Well, so you'll notice you have very good eyes, because it's, I'm sure it's a little hard to see on everyone's screens, but at the very bottom right-hand corner of the Renee Cox work, there is a hint of a yellow rose that's kind of like entering into the picture frame. I will say I don't 100% know the particular significance of that yellow rose, but know that it is intentionally included, especially considering that the entire background is essentially this kind of stark black expanse, and there's this one small inclusion of the yellow rose. Unfortunately, because she is still with us today, it's maybe a question that we can actually ask the artist directly. And as for, you know, the very acute kind of visual analysis of her hair and the strands of the whip. Again, that's I mean, going back to kind of how different people can read the image in very different ways. That is an interesting analysis of the work itself. Perhaps it was intentional. Perhaps that was just the way that her hair and the whip kind of lied. But you can clearly see that she's very intentionally posed, and every object, there's a very intentional inclusion of them.
So I just want to give Suzanne a chance to have the last word here. I know we need to move on and let Jessica kind of add her final comments. But Suzanne,
yeah, and I also want to encourage those who haven't yet spoke, if you want, you know, I know that technologically there's it's hard to see whose hand is raised, but please feel free to jump in when you're able.
Suzanne, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, it was just a technological blip. I didn't realize I had to physically lower my hand. So
okay.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
That's okay. We're all learning how to work with Zoom. All right, so just because we have about 15 minutes left, I think that we can move on to the next body of work by artist Gina Adams. So this is on the other side of the gallery. It's a series entitled Ancestor Beadwork Prism. And Vivian, I'll let you take it away, but do you want me to stay on this screen? Oh, or go to her particular work.
Just show me the next slide for just a moment.
So it's her broken treaty.
Oh, right. Actually, yes. So I just like you all to just visually kind of take stock of these images. This is part of a series. And so each one is an individual work of art, but obviously works of art that relate. And just orient yourself to what you're looking at. These are in fact digital. The media they're digital prints, right, Jessica?
Yep.
And we wanted to kind of give you a hand in sort of unpacking these images. So Gina Adams is a descendant of both indigenous and colonial Americans. She is Ojibwa and Anishinaabe, but she's also a direct descendant of John Adams. And in the next slide, we'll see another work of hers. It's from her Broken Treaty Quilt series, in which she takes stenciled letters and recreates treaties between the American federal government and different Native American communities, and places them on quilts in such a way that, as you can see, some of the letters are hard to read. And I just wondered, as you think about this type of artwork and the one before, where do you see kind of resonances? In what ways are these works like her Broken Quilt series work? Jane.
Whoops.
Jane, go ahead.
Oh, I hadn't raised my hand, but I will say something. And that is the piecemeal effect in the background of these digital prints seems to parallel the kind of fragmented piecemeal of all the letters that were put together in the quilt.
So the prism-like quality of the shapes behind the figures?
Yes, and the kind of fracturedness. That's a lot of these digitals, some of them seem to me like stained glass windows. It's not easy to see all of it, but you know, there's the sense of things being in pieces put together.
Great, thank you. And how about Claire? Hi, Claire. Claire, are you with us? Sorry, I'm gonna see. Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, so they remind me of quilt squares in the background.
Absolutely. I mean, the shape of the works themselves, they're square in format, and the shapes and designs that she's using here, although digitized, do recall the kinds of quilt squares that we see in traditional sort of Americana. Can we advance 2 slides, Jessica?
Sure.
In creating these works, Gina Adams was also inspired by photographs that she discovered of her ancestors in the National Museum of the American Indian, photographs that were taken by non-Native American photographers of noteworthy Native Americans, say in tribal delegations. And so maybe just one more slide forward. This is not one of Gina Adams' ancestors, but it's sort of an example of this kind of photography. And so she combined these 2 sources, her own work in quilt making and these images of her ancestors, in creating these works. And at this point, I'd like to ask, what's the impact of that? You know, how do you read these images? How are the images of her ancestors in some ways transformed by this representation? Side by side would probably be helpful here. All right, how about John?
I was just thinking, and I've looked at these for a long time, but I was just thinking the first time that it really does seem to be, we say things like, the soul of my grandmother is in her quilt. And it seems to be a visual representation of that idea, that here we get the photograph right into this quilted prismatic image. And it had a whole new power for me, just thinking about it that way, to think about the spirits of our ancestors as being in an object that we carry forward.
Right. There's something about bringing in this handcraft, this tradition, this long tradition of quilt making, and setting these figures within that tradition that gives them life and energy and soul, as you mentioned. Other thoughts?
Well, I also just want to give some context to how she created these works. I mean, it's interesting to think about it in relation to her handmade quilting work, but these, as Vivian mentioned, are digital prints. And so she would use, all of these images were made in the virtual digital space in programs such as Adobe Photoshop, where she is composing, by hand to a certain extent, this colorful patterning, or what she calls digital beadwork prisms behind her ancestral figures, and derived from actually the carpets and curtains in the original photographs. And so there's this very sharp contrast, as you can see from the archival images, against these like brilliant patterns. But even just the idea of working by hand, when it's moving into the virtual space. And, interestingly also to note that these images also just existed virtually until the exhibition. So they were printed intentionally for the exhibition itself. So I don't know if that changes kind of the way that you think about the works, her previous, her known practice of the broken treaty quilts, and how that perhaps transforms your understanding of these works, or even her practice.
And I'm curious about whether people have thoughts about the ways in which these images reflect her dual heritage.
See, yeah.
All right. We have a hand. Oh, great. Kimberly, join the conversation.
I think
Kimberly?
it's really, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a very interesting virtual or electronic version of a quilt to sample from the photograph and use that to build the quilt in the background, which is similar to using cloth, which might have been part of your family's cloth, to build a quilt that you then pass down.
And why do you think maybe, it's a choice to go digital? I mean, what's the impact? What's the power? What's the reason, do you think, for choosing a digital format from someone who clearly, loves to work with her hands, has worked with her hands? Do people have thoughts about that, about what that contributes to this work?
I do, but I don't know if you can hear me or see me. My camera is off. Elizabeth?
Yes, we can, Elizabeth.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I met Gina. Was Gina at the Hopkins Center asking passersby to cut up?
Yes, she was, and she was an artist in residence as well.
Yes, so I actually met her, but I'm to answer your question, I think it's wonderful that she chose the digital medium, because she is making such a strong connection between the photography of ancestors and what is now happening and what we can do or are trying to do digitally. It's crossing all of those lines, and it brings it closer together.
Great, right. So adding this element of time, past, present, future, and showing a continuity of practice from handcraft to digital format by choosing this type of media. Great, thanks, Elizabeth.
So Vivian, I think that I'm gonna just try to wrap up a little bit so we can maybe have some time at the end if anyone has questions. But I also just want to mention it because we're on this particular image. A lot of this work and this body of work for Gina was very much a way to honor her ancestors, as well as other figures who have been erased from historical narratives, including, so this is an image of her great uncle Mujaguk, who was a very respected elder across the Great Lakes, and Frances Densmore, who Densmore actually spent decades with the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, studying and preserving Native music, but was largely unaccredited to her male counterparts. And she learned, in her research that she had actually spent years with her great uncle. So this whole body of work is really meant, not just in addition to honoring her ancestors, but also to empower future generations who continue to strive for representation, creating space and enacting change. And it's potent that this is done or this is made digitally in the virtual, knowing that a lot of our younger generations are very much kind of living their lives through this virtual space. So we have just a few more minutes. Does anyone have any last questions or comments before wrapping up?
Jessica, we had somebody was curious to know, what's the difference? What are the differences between experiencing a virtual world presentation like this one today and actually being in the museum or a gallery presentation?
Oh, I feel like that's the question.
That's a big question, yes.
We're a lot more comfortable.
Well, aside from not having as many technical issues, a lot of these, that is an interesting question, because a lot of art, contemporary artists are actually also interested in moving into the virtual space and kind of what the possibilities are of decentering physical sites and the physicality of objects themselves. I think that people are just so used to physically experiencing the space of the museum, experiencing and seeing artworks in person. And it's hard, other than us having a more intimate dialogue in the gallery space, if I were to give you an exhibition tour, it's kind of comparing apples to oranges just a little bit. I think that though this is different, there is other possibilities of how we can have conversations about an exhibition or artworks in a space like this. That may be a little bit different, but yeah, Vivian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think that what's really hard in this format is the kind of emotional connection on many, many levels. I know as a teacher in the galleries, I have a sense of where my group is at any given moment, how they're responding based on body language, just the tone of the room. I know that these works, particularly the Renee Cox, is just so large and overwhelming that there's an emotional response to the work itself. And then there's just the dynamics of all the participants in a space together. And it's really challenging not to have all of those cues present in a setting like this.
Yeah, and also, a lot of these artists, including the Renee Cox, they're really hitting on some very difficult subject matters, which is hard to have in a group dialogue in a virtual space when we have to kind of select you to speak and whatnot. But again, I'm very keen to see what new possibilities there are, as opposed to just seeing this as that this is that this is not allowing us to have conversations. But I'm not, we'll see what the lasting effects of this is and how things adapt and evolve, and how museums themselves can actually adopt perhaps virtual practices that it can expand audiences. I don't really know if that answers your question, but I think it's something that we're all going to be contending with for a little while.
Could I say something? I'm not sure you're seeing me.
Sure, Elizabeth.
Yes. One of the nice things about today's presentation is that you could virtually take us into the walls where these works are hanging currently at the Hood. That isn't the case, or may not be the case, I should say, of new shows that are yet to be hung. My concern is something that would be missing from a virtual gallery would be that space, as well as the individual presentation of each work of art. For example, when you showed us the engravings versus the scale of the photograph, we don't get to see that. We don't get to see the matting, the framing, the presentation. How can we get around that as galleries and museums?
Again, that is, I think, a question of the era. I definitely don't have an answer to that. If I did, I feel like we would all be having, we would all be okay. But I definitely understand the what is missing when you're not actually in seeing or witnessing the actual physical object. But again, I maybe just trying to shift the framework a little bit and seeing like, okay, maybe there are limitations, but what are the possibilities within those limitations? You know, even with the virtual, although as expansive as it is, like not everybody has access to the internet, for example. But it also, you know, on the flip side, not everyone has access to these physical sites. You know, there's only a certain kind of constituency and demographic that can come to the Hood Museum or that can travel to the Hood Museum. So then how can we reach broader audiences beyond just the physical context? And so that's, I think that for me, this is an exercise in trying to kind of explore what those possibilities are, you know, while of course kind of respecting and maintaining, you know, the physical space of an exhibition or a museum. But again, what possibilities are present now that we are, you know, these worlds are kind of colliding a little bit. But you can't necessarily, as I mentioned at the top, you know, we didn't intend to replicate a virtual kind of, or what it is to be in a museum space, in a virtual space, because you just can't do that. So then what else can we do rather than just replicating like a virtual exhibition tour? So this is just us dipping our toe into, you know, what that can potentially look like. And hopefully this can be a collaborative exercise for all of us to figure out, you know, what those kind of programs or experiences can look like. But I will, now that it's 1:30, I do want to just quickly to end and ask for ask a favor. We really, really appreciate everyone being here with us. A lot of you stayed through the entire time. So we would really appreciate your feedback because this is our first virtual program. It's a very brief Google assessment. And the answers can be as short or as long as you'd like. You can please refer to the URL, which Sharon is going to share in the chat function to everybody. And if you have a smartphone, you can also scan the QR code and it'll take you directly to the assessment site.
Right, all you need to do is open up your camera and just wave it over that QR code and the site should open automatically.
Yes, and so just to note, our next program is with artist Colleen Randall and poet Jeffrey Friedman on April 16th. So please check our website for more information. And in the meantime, you know, again, thank you so much for being here with us today, and please stay safe and hope you're all taking good care during this time. And we look forward to seeing you virtually or in person soon.
Yes, we miss you all.
Yeah, we miss you.
See you all in the museum once again, but how lovely to be able to be with you here for this 1 hour in conversation.